This is the CERAPAD KIN X from TJ Exclusives, the latest version of the CERAPAD series, which according to TJ Exclusives is the definitive edition, as they've spent 40,000 USD in R&D to develop the KIN X's surfacing. This hefty investment, again according to TJ Exclusives, supposedly gives the KIN X several improvements over the older CERAPAD models, not only in terms of performance but also durability. But despite what TJX is advertising here for the KIN X, this pad missed the mark for me in almost every single way, as the pad has multiple critical issues with its surfacing and design that make it perform very inconsistently. I was also in a very unique position when I reviewed the KIN X, as I have both an initial review unit and a retail unit, and as it turns out there's actually a pretty significant difference between the review units that was sent to reviewers initially and the retail versions that were sent out to customers. So in today's video we're going to talk all about the differences between the review and the retail versions, and talk about the myriad of issues that is plaguing the definitive version of the CERAPAD in today's episode of the mel0n review. But before we get into it, I did want to quickly say I was previously affiliated with TJ Exclusives, but I have since canceled that agreement after my experience here with the KIN X. But I just wanted to let you know I was previously affiliated with them, but my past affiliations are not going to affect my opinions on their products or anything else I cover here on the channel. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n review. In terms of testing parameters, I used both the review and retail versions of my KIN X for approximately 1 month each, daily driving the pads for both work and gaming. For skates, as per usual, I used all the skates in my collection, but I ended up using the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Air Dots and Donut skates the most over my testing, and for sensitivity I played on my usual range of 40 to 50 centimeter per 360 here on both versions of the KIN X. Alright, now when it comes to in-game performance, the KIN X, just like the previous CERAPADs, is a very unique pad with a performance profile you can't find stock on any other pad on the market. But oddly enough, while the KIN X is advertised as having a similar performance profile to the KIN V2 in terms of initial unbreaking frictions, it has a much higher degree of dynamic friction. Because of this, the KIN X's frictions are much more balanced than they were on the older CERAPADs, but strangely the pad is much faster than the KIN V2 by a significant margin, which was rather surprising given TJX's marketing for the pad. That said though, the pad is still very controlled, just not to the same degree that the KIN V2 was. From my testing, the pad does perform well, at least initially. Personally speaking, I much prefer the more balanced controlled performance profile of the KIN X over the more heavy control focused performance profiles of the KIN V2. The KIN X is much better suited for all aim styles, not just static and flicking aiming like the KIN V2 was, so the pad is great for both more dynamic and tracking aiming games, but it's also great for static and flicking games as well. But while the KIN X performed well at first, the longer I used the pad, the more issues I ran into with it, and over my testing, as I mentioned earlier, I ran into several critical issues that heavily hampered the KIN X's performance. We'll talk more in depth about these issues later in this video, but for a pad that's supposedly the result of $40,000 worth of R&D, I'm shocked this pad has so many issues. In terms of pricing and versions, just like the KIN V2, the KIN X is available in 6 sizes. The pad in its stock configuration comes in gray or purple splat versions. There are also a bunch of limited editions that will be releasing in the future. Currently 2 of these versions are available in the form of the Zara and the Kaya, with more coming soon. Now one of the coolest features of the KIN X is that TJX does offer full custom printing for the KIN X for an additional $10 USD, and you can print pretty much whatever you want onto the pad's surface, which is a feature totally unique to the KIN X, at least when it comes to hard pads, and the pad's print quality is actually extremely good, but we'll talk more about this later in this video. In terms of unboxing, the overall unboxing experience is a very no-frills approach. The pad comes in a TJX branded box, but inside there's not nearly as much protective packaging as you'd find on other glass pads, as the only form of protective padding around the pad is these foam bumpers on the pad's corners. These foam bumpers position the pad so it's suspended inside the packaging, enough that small impacts won't make contact with the pad's surface, but I doubt it'll be protected from heavier impacts. The only other protective packaging on the pad for shipping is a plastic wrapper around the pad itself. This will technically protect the pad from debris if the outer box gets compromised during shipping, but again this wrapper isn't going to protect the pad from serious impacts. Aside from the pad itself, there's no accessories included. Admittedly, it would have been very nice to see a cleaning cloth included, especially considering the pad's issues with dust and debris, and I would have rather seen more protective foam around the entire pad to protect it during shipping, like we've seen from every other glass pad on the market, as I have some pretty serious concerns about the pad's survivability chances with some rougher shipping couriers. In terms of build quality and QC, just like we've seen with the previous CERAPADs, the KIN X is a glass pane coated with a ceramic coating and a base added to the bottom of the glass. Both my initial and review units are fine from my testing. Both the pad surfaces are consistent without any noticeable physical issues. The pad's bases are also very well implemented in both the retail and review units of my KIN X, but notice how I said bases though, as oddly enough the retail and review units of the KIN X have a completely different different base design. Now I'll talk more about the differences later, but for now just know that the retail version has the old foot design we saw in the previous CERAPADs, and the review version of my KIN X has a full silicone base, similar to the bases we've seen on other hardpads on the market. And over my testing, both versions of my KIN X have physically held up fine, and I haven't noticed any issues of wearing on either of my pad surfacing, so durability seems good for now, but I can't speak to long-term use. I also wanted to quickly talk about print quality. On hard pads, specifically glass pads, there is a limit to how clear the print can be, as the glass will always distort the image to a degree, but the KIN X is very unique to other hard pads, as the surface design is printed directly onto the pad's ceramic surface, which drastically improves the pad's print quality. Even when compared to the Glassworks Hana, which has arguably the best visual clarity we've seen from a hard pad to date, the KIN X is significantly clearer visually. So while I do have a myriad of other complaints with the KIN X, I do have to give TJX credit here, as their print quality is the best I've seen in a hard pad so far, and this is the only fully customizable hard pad available on the market, at least as of recording this review. Alright, let's talk about the KIN X's surfacing next. The surfacing is still ceramic based since it's a CERAPAD, that's kind of to be expected, but according to TJX it's been modified and improved, increasing its dynamic friction by 13% while apparently having the same level of static and braking friction as the KIN V2, as well as supposedly being more durable than the older CERAPAD surfacing. To the hand, the KIN X surfacing feels much smoother than the KIN V2's rougher plate-like surfacing. The KIN X feels more akin to how a glass pad would feel, but it has a little more textural feedback. From my testing, TJ Exclusive's claim about the increased dynamic frictions is true, as the pad's dynamic friction is much faster than the KIN V2's, but TJX's claim that the KIN X has the same level of static and braking frictions as the KIN V2 isn't true at all, as the KIN X has way less initial and braking frictions than the KIN V2 did. Therefore, from my experience, the KIN X feels much more akin to a highly controlled glass pad rather than the CERAPAD KIN V2 in terms of its frictions, which is the opposite of what TJX is advertising for this pad. But while the KIN X's performance profile and friction curve is in my opinion much better than the ones we saw in the KIN V2, the surfacing is far from perfect. Since the surfacing's base is still ceramic, it sadly has many of the same moisture and debris related issues that the older CERAPADs had, as well as some new issues. Now I will talk more in depth about the issues later in this video, but for now I wanted to highlight one issue, as it's arguably the most impactful one, as both of my KIN X's, the review and retail versions, weirdly develop these slow gluey spots randomly on the pad's surface. These spots heavily impacted the pad's performance, as the pad's frictions were altered if you ran your mouse over them, causing inconsistent glides and uneven levels of initial and braking frictions. I was able to remove these spots by rubbing the pad surface with a microfiber cloth, but after a few hours of use, they returned in different areas. So while the KIN X's surfacing does perform well and has a great friction curve in my opinion, it's marred by some pretty serious consistent issues, mainly due to these weird slow gluey spots. I also wanted to mention that the KIN X has a very strange work-in period, where the pad surface will speed up slightly over time. I experienced this strange work-in on both versions of my KIN X, and when I asked TJ Exclusives about this work-in period, they didn't really give me an explanation for why this was happening, which is very odd considering they're advertising they spent $40,000 in R&D to develop this pad, and you'd think this work-in period would be something they would have caught during their rigorous R&D, but there's no mention of this work-in period on any of TJ Exclusive's marketing or their product page, which is very odd. And sadly, another area where the KIN X surfacing has a lot of issues is with skate compatibility. Now, since it's a hard pad, it is technically compatible with all shapes of skates, be it dots, donuts, or stock skates, but unlike the previous CERAPADs, the KIN X surfacing absolutely obliterates some kinds of skates to a much higher degree than any hard pad I've tested to date. From my experience on both of my KIN X's, standard 100% PTFE skates such as the X-Ray Pad Jade or Jade Airs and the Unusual Way Sports Silver Fox skates are unusable, as within a few days of use they get worn to such a degree they become slow, scratchy, and extremely loud. This also means that most mice's stock skates, since they're made out of 100% PTFE, will get obliterated within a matter of days here on the KIN X. For context, here's how a fresh pair of the X-Ray Pad Jade Air skates sound compared to a set that's been used for a week on the KIN X. Now, hard pad optimized skates such as the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Air and Pro Air series skates do last longer, but even those skates have significantly reduced lifespans here on the Kin X compared to other hard pads. Now, the best skate type I found for use here on the Kin X was, unsurprisingly, the TGX Exacts in plastic dots, as their extreme durability prevents them from getting chewed up by the Kin X surface, and they did have a decent performance profile, but while they were usable and had the best durability, they have one critical downside, as they are extremely loud due to their material. For context about the level of audio feedback here with TGX's skates, here's how the plastics and exacts sound on my retail version of the Kin X. So because of the plastics and exacts extreme degree of audio feedback, I ended up sticking with the Obsidian Air Dots and Donuts, as while they had a much shorter lifespan than the plastics or exacts, the added layer of SMPF foam made them astronomically quieter, but I doubt these skates are going to have a consistent performance for very long due to the Kin X's high wear rate. I also wanted to mention that the Kin X's various issues with different skate materials also massively affects their performance, specifically softer skates, as the more a skate is worn, the slower and more controlled it will feel, so depending on what size, material, and shape the skates used on the Kin X are, their consistency and performance will deteriorate variably. This will also offset that slight working period I mentioned earlier, but this will depend on the skate type you use on the Kin X, but this whole skate compatibility and high wear rate is just another aspect that adds even more inconsistency to the Kin X's performance. Next up, let's talk about audio feedback. Now, I know I just talked about this in terms of skates, but it turns out the different base versions that I have on my two versions of the Kin X does heavily impact the audio feedback between these two versions. As I mentioned earlier, the retail version of the Kin X that was sent to all the reviewers has a full silicone base style we've seen used on almost every hard pad on the market, while the retail versions of the Kin X have the 4-foot base design that we saw used on the older CERAPADs. Now, the differing bases between the retail and the review versions of the Kin X might not seem like that big of a deal on paper, but as it turns out, not only does the retail version's foot design perform astronomically worse than the full silicone base on my review copy, the foot design base is also significantly louder. To better explain this, here's a sound test between both the retail and the review units of my Kin X using the TJ Exact skates on my X2H. As you can tell, there is a pretty significant difference between these two bases, and I generally don't understand why TJX used this foot-based design, as these bases had the same performance issues on the older CERAPADs. And since this is supposedly the definitive version of the CERAPAD, at least according to TJX, using the same old base design with the myriad of issues it has on your definitive version just seems very counterintuitive, and when you compare the retail Kin X's base design to all the other hard pads that have released recently with full silicone bases, like the Glassworks Hana or Lock-On Haru for example, the retail Kin X's base stands out like a sore thumb, while the review unit of my Kin X with its full silicone base is on par with those other pads. Next, let's talk about the effects of dust, debris, and moisture. Now, normally speaking, this section's pretty short when I talk about hard pads, because the only issues that normally happens is that maybe if dust and debris lands on the pad, it's going to cause some scratching sounds, but as I mentioned earlier, the Kin X has a lot more issues than typical hard pads do, specifically with dust and debris. These issues are similar to the ones we saw in the Kin V1 and Kin V2, but much worse. The biggest reason for this is that the ceramic material that the surface is based off of, when it's exposed to moisture, gets kind of sticky. Now, moisture spots aren't an issue per se, generally speaking, but when debris gets involved, this becomes a major problem, as any moisture spots get mixed with oils, dead skin, and other debris, and when that moisture does eventually evaporate, it leaves a sticky residue on the pad surface, which you can feel physically when running your mouse or your finger across the pad's surface. Initially, I thought these sticky spots were being caused by an error with the coating's application or bonding, but this issue is present on both of my Kin X's, and it's not isolated to a specific area as these spots randomly appear all over the pad. So either I have two defective pads, which I highly doubt, or when TGX supposedly spent $40,000 in R&D to develop the Kin X's updated surfacing, didn't update the surface as much as they were alluding to in their marketing, as you'd think fixing the moisture related issues would have been a priority considering the issues we had in the older CERAPADs, but they're still present here in the Kin X, but they're way worse. Now you can help deter these slow spots from developing by using an arm sleeve, as that helps to cut down on moisture and debris from your arm making contact with the pad surfacing, but you can't prevent humidity and other environmental factors from causing these slow spots from developing as a whole. Another way I found of preventing these slow spots from developing on the pad surface was to point a fan directly at the pad during use, as the constant airflow helps to evaporate the moisture on the pad surface faster than it does naturally, but having a fan blasting at a pad surface while playing in the middle of the winter was a less than ideal experience. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can clean these slow spots off of the pad by wiping the pad off with a microfiber cloth, but wiping the pad as frequently as possible and using an arm sleeve is arguably going to be the most effective way of preventing these slow spots from forming, but again, environmental factors will likely cause these to form no matter what, and the only real way you can make this pad immune to these things is to point a fan at it 24/7, but that is just not a realistic solution. And next up, I wanted to quickly talk about bass performance. As I mentioned earlier, my retail version and my review of my Kin X have two different bass styles. The retail version is using the old foot style bass we saw in the older CERAPADs, and my review unit is using a full silicone bass. Now, I already talked about one side to this foot bass design the retail versions use with its audio feedback, but another issue with this bass type design, as we've seen in the previous CERAPADs, is its anchoring strength. Now, the full silicone bass version of my Kin X anchors itself wonderfully and doesn't slip or shift at all during use, even when I put a bunch of weight on it, but the retail version with its foot bass design can shift very easily if too much weight is being pushed across the pad. Now, admittedly, this won't be as much of an issue on the larger, heavier versions of the Kin X, but on smaller versions of the Kin X, I'd be very concerned about the pad shifting or tilting during use, as the smaller pads are much lighter, and this foot bass design, as we just mentioned, does not anchor it to desks very well at all. On a personal note, I also really dislike that TGX sent reviewers a special, or I guess cherry-picked version of the Kin X with this full silicone base, as the retail versions aren't going to have a silicone base, they're going to have the old, worse base design they used on their previous CERAPADs. And oddly enough, on the Kin X's product page, TGX doesn't show or mention the base at all. So people who watch reviews of the Kin X are going to be led to assume that the pad comes with a full silicone base, when in reality it doesn't, and this is something I do not like, as this is technically speaking a form of cherry-picking units. And the fact that they're not telling anyone about the base on their website makes this even more suspicious. So I absolutely think that TGX should be much more upfront with their marketing and show the base type here, because it is very different from the ones you're going to see in review units. Alright, and last, let's talk about another disappointing aspect to the Kin X, its compatibility with bare arms. Now, funnily enough, on the product page for the Kin X, TGX says that the Kin X was designed to be the most skin-friendly, stick-resistant surface, but just like many of the other advertised features here for the Kin X, this is not true at all from my experience. On both versions of my Kin X, the moment your forearm, hand, or fingers touch the pad surface, it will stick significantly, much more so than I've seen with any other glass pad. Now, I assume my stickier experience here with the Kin X is a combination of my sweatier hands and the coating's moisture properties that we talked about earlier, but this stickiness was a major issue as I have very large hands, and oftentimes I claw grip my mice, and a lot of the time my fingers will actually make contact with the pad surface. So over my testing here with the Kin X with my natural claw grip, my fingers on the side of the mouse would stick to the pad, which heavily impacted its usability. Now, for people with drier hands, I think the surface will be far less sticky, but keep in mind that environmental factors can cause the pad to get sticky if moisture can't evaporate off of it fast enough, so even if you have dry hands and you use the pad in a humid environment, you will most likely still have stickiness issues. Because of this, I would highly recommend wearing an arm sleeve here on the Kin X, but a standard arm sleeve isn't going to cut it as your fingers and wrist are exposed to the pad surface. You will need to use a palm sleeve here on the Kin X, as the only areas of your hand that will make contact with the pad are your fingers. You'll still need to be conscious of where your fingers are resting on the side of your mouse, of course, to prevent them from making contact, but the experience using a palm sleeve like this is going to be much better than using a bare arm or a standard arm sleeve. And as I mentioned earlier, using an arm sleeve does also help to prevent those sticky spots that develop on the pad surface. So across the board, I would highly really recommend using a full palm sleeve here on the Kin X. I do not recommend using this pad as a bare arm because it is not non-stick in any way, shape, or form, unlike what TJX is advertising here for this pad. Alright, well, in closing, overall, I am extremely disappointed here with the TJ Exclusives Kin X. In all honesty, I had really high hopes for this pad, as I did enjoy using the previous CERAPAD, specifically the V2. Sure, it had some downsides, but overall it was a pretty decent pad, but the Kin X just misses the mark for me in every single way. And while the pad's performance profile itself and its friction curve is really good and definitely an improvement from the Kin V2, there are just so many issues with the pad surface, I can't in good conscience recommend the pad to anyone in its current state. I also have to say, I am just really disappointed in the way TJX has gone about releasing and marketing this pad, as not only have reviewers gotten cherry-picked versions of the Kin X with a better base, and they're kind of leading people to assume that they're getting a full base version on their retail versions, which they're not. They're getting the same shitty bases we saw on the previous CERAPADs. There are so many issues with this surfacing we've seen on the previous CERAPADs that are still here, and on the product page for the Kin X, in the first line of text, they're boasting how they spent $40,000 USD in R&D to develop this pad surface, but it has the same issues as the previous CERAPADs and more issues that absolutely should have been caught during R&D. And what makes me really question their claim here is that a lot of the stuff they're advertising for this pad just isn't true. They are correct in saying that the Kin X has a higher dynamic friction, they're right with that, but saying that the Kin X and the CERAPAD V2 have comparable static and braking frictions is just outright false, as the Kin X is way faster. They're saying this pad is non-stick when, as we've seen with the previous CERAPADs, the ceramic coating holds on to moisture much longer than glass does, doesn't evaporate at nearly the same rate. Of course, there's some environmental factors to that, but this pad is not non-stick in any way, shape, or form, and the fact that they're advertising it as such is crazy. And there are just so many other issues with the Kin X. If they actually put all this money into developing this pad surfacing, it should be perfect, but it just seems like a worse version of their previous pads, which just doesn't make any sense towards their marketing. I think it's much more likely that they spent $40,000 USD in the machining to create this pad, or however they're doing the printing for this pad. That seems much more likely, because in my opinion, I don't even think they spent $1 in R&D actually trying to make the surface, as it is just a worse version of the surfaces we've seen on the previous pads. I also wanted to say I'm going to crash out kind of hard on the review community here. A lot of people who reviewed this pad did not do their due diligence. This pad for the first week is fantastic. There are little qualms I had with this pad within the first week, but the longer I use it, the more issues I had with it. And a lot of the people who have made these glowing reviews for the CERAPAD Kin X, it's really obvious that they didn't actually test the pad for long enough, because either I have two defective CERAPADs from two different batches, one of which was a review unit which should be perfect, or a lot of people who are reviewing this pad just aren't doing their job and they're just being yes men for TJX. And while there are some negative reviews for the Kin X, the positive reviews for this pad far outweigh the negatives, and it's very obvious that a lot of people in the community just did not do their job in reviewing this pad, and that's really disappointing to see, because it's leading a lot of people to make false purchases about a product that is just a direct downgrade from what they've released before, with multiple new issues. I almost fell into the same pit too, because when I was first testing my original CERAPAD, I was like, oh, this pad's great, I have no issues with it, I'm just going to go ahead and do my review. But I remember I heard some issues with durability on the old Kin V2 surfacing, and I was like, I'm going to take a little bit of extra time, and I'm really glad I did, because if I didn't do that, I would have fallen into the same pit, because for the first week or so, this pad is fantastic. After that, it just turns into an absolute mess. The only edge that I think the Kin X has over the competition in the hard pad market is their print quality, which is very good, and the fact you can customize the pad is awesome to see. But a pretty pad is one thing, a good performing pad should be the priority, and having a pad with custom art that performs like shit just isn't worth the money. You are much better off going for other options on the market. If you were considering the Kin X but you want a pad with a similar performance profile to it, I would recommend buying something like the Lock-On Hood or Glassworks Hana or Polarity pads, as they are going to be controlled hard pads. They aren't going to be as controlled as the Kin X, but your experience on those pads will be astronomically better, as they are just much better pads that have been actually R&D'd properly. And if you want to get one-for-one performance, just get a set of the Extra Pad Obsidian Pro Air dots or donuts, and your experience will be roughly even to what you get here on the Kin X, just without all the downsides. But that's going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. I'm sorry for the whole crash out at the end there, but this was just a very frustrating experience for a reviewer like myself, because there's just so many things with this pad that drove me nuts. But anyways, thank you very much to our channel members who make what I do here on the channel possible. If you would like to support what I do here on the channel with the Teardown project and of course the in-depth reviews like this one, you can become a member here on YouTube for only $2 Canadian per month. You can use code mel0n spelled with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming Gear, Metkeys, and a bunch of other retailers to save yourself some money off your orders and help directly support the channel. Thanks again for watching my review of the TJ exclusives Kin X, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.